All right. Before we broke, the thing that I was curious about, because I've had this innumerable times, I think even we felt this a bit when we were developing our last project together. When you're developing with somebody and it's based on them and it's based on their real life, particularly something that is really deeply felt, how do you get around that moment where, and I don't know if this happened with Billy, where you suggest something and that person says, yeah, but it didn't happen that way. That's not...
Those are the, it didn't happen that much with Billy. When I say that much, you're married to what indeed happened, but you've got to make a case for what should happen in this piece that you're writing. Now, if you're going to stand firm and say, I want it the way it did happen, okay, then it's my job as your collaborator to get into that head and go, okay, what's the benefit of being faithful to the truth? When I wrote Bunny Bunny, the most literal and faithful thing to the truth that I wrote was the very, very first draft of the book. It wasn't meant to be published. So I just relived my, reconstructed my relationship with Gilda through 14 years, everything I can remember. But now I wasn't wired for sound. It's not like I took a transcript of what we were, okay? So I remembered it as best as I could. Once I decided, and then when it was over with, fine, okay, it was a catharsis. Once I decided to publish it, you put on a different hat and you go, all right, we can use a better joke here. I mean, maybe we take this scene and this scene and put it together. Mm-hmm. So then you lower the bar in terms of what your standard is. And then ultimately it became a play. And then I had to change that too. What would these two characters do in that situation? Maintain their affection for each other, maintain their identities without bastardizing history so much that there's something, you know.
So it could be truthful without being actual.
Well, you know, they're historic, it becomes a historical novel,
right,
in a sense, you know. A good friend of mine, Mary Carr, is probably America's premier memoirist right now. And she is quoted as saying that memory is by nature fraudulent. And there is a fraudulence. We remember what we want to remember. We tell the story that we want to tell. And so it becomes, what's my reality? What's my, what do I want to say here? What do I choose to discard? What do I want to keep with me? And so when someone says, well, it didn't happen that way, if they're doing it because they're clinging to a memory for the sake of memory, that's one thing. If it's clinging to that because they don't want to show a person that they're portraying in a bad way, okay, that's another discussion. But your job is to be firm, but to choose your battles also. What could I live with as somebody who's writing this thing, you know, or helping to write and construct this thing?
All right, so the other medium, and I just want to make sure we cover this as well, that you've also spent a lot of time in, other than television, other than novels, other than theater, is you've written, you know, a number of feature films.
Yes.
First of all, is the process for you different depending on sort of the intended medium?
The process is different. Certain things are more internal and have a singular vision, okay? So you got to get the first draft down by yourself and then call in somebody to reassess and to attack it with you. I wrote this screenplay called The Story of Us. And the first couple of drafts I wrote by myself. And what it was is an examination of a marriage. And the tagline ultimately was, the subtitle was, "Can a marriage survive 15 years of marriage?" So there was no seminal moment when two people split. It was about the wear and tear of the job and the slow erosion of the romance and what happens 15 years later. The state of it. I didn't want to have a black hat and I didn't want to have a white hat. I wanted to do it about the state of the institution. The first couple of drafts I wrote, the guy was great. Everything that was wrong, she had done. And I needed help. Okay, so I asked Jessie Nelson if she wanted to write it with me, and she brought her marriage to it. She had the wife's point of view, and it became more even-handed that way. And then when Rob Reiner decided to direct it, he brought his marriage to it. So it became an amalgam, if you will, of three marriages. So it's more fun, always to collaborate. The synergy is great, it's social. At the same time, there was a case where my screenplay, it was not right. It was because it was too personal, and it was, I didn't have Robin's point of view, and so it ran counter to what the premise of it was supposed to be. I knew I needed help, So I went to Castle Rock, who commissioned the script. I said, for the next draft, can we hire, Jessie, and she'll bring her marriage to it and her point of view to it.
Now, did you come to that conclusion on your own, that there was an authenticity that was lacking?
Yeah, I knew it. And I couldn't get inside a woman's head, what was wrong with her, whatever disappointments I had, the my wife character expressed were things that I heard my wife complain about me, but it was still from my perspective. And it wasn't, it lacked a certain validity. It lacked a certain, even-handedness when it came to the situation,
Now, what was the first feature film? Was Dragnet your first feature?
Yeah, well, actually, I can't count Guild Alive, although I contributed to that. That was Mike Nichols filmed a version, the Broadway, he filmed the Broadway show, right. Guild Alive. I was one of 10 writers. Lorne directed it on Broadway, and the writers, I was one of, I think, 10, all people who had, and that was I wrote a few pieces for it for characters that I had developed with Gilda, for Gilda, as did others. Paul Schaefer wrote for it because he wrote songs for it, Right. Michael O'Donoghue wrote this brilliant song, Talk Dirty to the Animals, which Gilda sang. Okay, so I can't really count that. Dragnet was then the first one that I co-wrote with Dan Aykroyd, and it was great fun. He asked me to join him. It was a parody of Dragnet. And I lived with, it was like living with Joe Friday for a few months. I was doing the Shandling show, so I'd work with him on weekends and hiatuses from the show. And I remember that we went to his house in Martha's Vineyard, and we wrote a lot up there. And it was, I was living with Joe Friday. He got into the character and the cadence of it and whatever.
Were you a fan of the TV show?
Yeah,
Did you have to study the TV show?
No, I refreshed my memory maybe by watching one. No, I had watched it growing up. I knew who Joe Friday was. I know who Gannon was, and I knew the stiffness of the character. And once again, living with Danny, who was so straight-backed and talking in that syncopation that Jack Webb did.
Right.
Oh, it was real easy, and. It was, and Tom Hanks played his partner, Strebeck, Pep Strebeck, yeah.
All right, so, look, you knew I was going to do this.
You bastard, I know where you're going, yes.
Yeah, so in talking about your movies, I feel this interview is incomplete unless we talk about North.
Okay, here's what happened. Oh, fuck. Oh, I'm sorry, that's with the PH again.
With the PH.
Yeah, I left SNL. I decided to stay in New York. I married Robin, And I started writing off-Broadway and off-Broadway plays, magazine pieces like for the New Yorker and the Atlantic, and I wrote a little novella. Our son Adam was born, and he got to that age where he would sit across from me and Robin at the dinner table, and you can tell from the expression on his face when he looked at us, the kid was thinking, I can do better than these two, you know? So I wrote a book about a 9-year-old boy named North, who didn't feel appreciated by his parents, declared himself a free agent, and went all over the world offering his services as a devoted son to the highest bidding set of parents.
It's a great, great concept.
It was a great concept. The book did just okay. It fell through the cracks. Was it a kid's book? Was it I had hoped that it would be, you know, what's that book that Jules Feiffer wrote that was a, oh God, that's considered a classic. I can't remember it right now. That it would be, you know, The Wizard of Oz, somebody in quest of something, and ultimately
like The Little Prince.
Well, there was The Little Prince, but there was that Pfeiffer book that I can't seem
think
to.
of the title of the
yeah,
Pfeiffer book.
I'll remember it probably in the car on the way home, and so it was. I sent the book. I sent the galleys to Rob Reiner, who had hosted the third Saturday Night Live ever, and we had become fast friends from that time. And all I wanted was a blurb for the book jacket. Mm-hmm. He read it. Phantom Toll Booth.
Phantom Toll Booth. Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
You know, when dementia sets in, you know, sometimes there's these gaps. Okay. He called me after reading it, and he said, you know, I'm a director now. No shit. He did Spinal Tap. He did When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men. No kidding, you know, Stand By Me. He said, I'd like to make this as a movie. Well, this is music to any writer's ears. You know, you write a book and you get hired to adapt the screenplay. We moved out to LA the second year of the Shandling Show, and when the Shandling Show ended, and after I did this god-awful, horrible, had this terrible experience doing this show called Good Sports.
Oh, the Ryan O'Neal, Farrah Fawcett.
Ryan O'Neal and Farrah Fawcett. Ugh. In any event, I got a TV deal over at Castle Rock, who gave me a television deal, but also bought the rights to North. And I worked on the screenplay. And the next thing I know, it's a $50 million movie. It's got Bruce Willis, Elijah Wood, Jason Alexander, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, my old friend Dan Aykroyd, Kathy Bates, Alan Arkin, and this 8-year-old actress named Scarlett Johansson, okay? And we do this movie, and there's a big premiere. The whole family's there, the whole town is there. This is LA. I flew my parents out from Boca. You know, Florida had 2 less Jews that night, okay? And it was a great night. The next morning, reviews come out. Dan, I don't know if you remember Roger Ebert's review of North, or carry it with you, as I think you should. It would teach you some humility. But, where the fuck did it go? Here it is.
So you have carried it in your wallet all this time since this review came out?
Well, yeah. I mean, look, I do all sorts of speeches all over the country, so I keep it in the wallet because I read it during my speaking engagements. But yeah, I do have it. This is probably Well, you tell me. This is what Roger Ebert, who was then like probably the most influential film critic in the country at the time, this is what he thought of this movie that I worked for on 2 years. I hated this movie. Hated, hated, hated. Hated, hated, hated this movie. Hated it. Hated every simpering, stupid, vacant audience, insulting moment of it. Hated the sensibility that thought anyone would like it. Hated the implied insult to the audience by its belief that anyone would actually be entertained by it. Now, on the surface, this may seem like an unfavorable review, but if you read it a couple more times, I think he kind of liked it. It was dreadful. We lived in LA where everybody roots for everybody else's failure. You know, Robin would come home from the supermarket where she was accosted by other women, and she said, can we order in for a while? And Adam came home from school and said, can we change our last name to Sorkin? You know, and I had always wondered, and it was devastating, I had always wondered what it would be like if indeed I ran into Roger Ebert. And about 10 years later, when I had written one of my books, I was on book tour. And I was in Chicago, where he lived. Mm-hmm. I think he wrote for the Chicago Sun-Times, one of those. And I'm there in a restaurant, and over at that table, wearing this oversized sweater with all the autumn colors in it, like gold and brown and burnt orange and puke kind of green, you know, phlegm green, and was Roger Ebert at that
very
table.
Descriptive.
Well, he got up and went to the men's room. I excused myself from my table, and I followed him. I had no idea what I was going to do. It was as if I was a spectator of myself. I was just hoping that whatever happened wouldn't end with the police having to show up, okay? I meet him in the men's room. Now we're at the sink, looking into the mirror, washing our hands. And I go, Roger? He looks up. Alan Zweibel. Blood drains from his face, and now we're facing each other, and I say, Roger, I just have to tell you that I hate, 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 hate that sweater you're wearing. And he smiled, I smiled, he started laughing, I started, and we shook hands, you know. And that's the end of my Roger Ebert story.
You know what? I've never heard the...
There's a little coda to the whole thing. Yeah, I had written, when he died, I wrote this story for the New Yorker. It was called Roger and Me.
Perfect. All right, listen, we are running desperately short on time. If we have time for 2 questions, I'll ask 2, but one I definitely just wanted to make sure I hit. One person we've not really touched on, you've been a guest, you've been a writer on the show. Talk a little bit about your experience with David Letterman.
David Letterman, I have nothing but great things and raves about. I admired as a viewer what he was doing with the form. I thought that there was something, if you want to say that that torch was passed down from Steve Allen and the people who took the talk show and beat it up a little bit and took you behind the scenes and had the guy living under the stairs and Larry Bud Melman and all the different cams that he did. And it was the SNL of the talk show, I had always felt, in terms of, we knew what it looked like, but he took you inside, you know, and Shandling and I used to think that, would like to think that we were doing that with its Gary Shandling show, with this sitcom. as far as being a guest on it is concerned, he put me on maybe 7 or 8 times as a writer. Whenever I had a book to promote, he'd put me on. Yeah, and I got along with him really well. And and he let me read from one of my books. I think the only other writer he let read from his book, and you can check this out, was David Sedaris, where I actually read an excerpt from the book.
Yeah, you read from the other Schulman.
I read from the other Schulman, and I read a piece where, a section where I talk about having plagiarized the lyrics to The Boxer and try to pass it off as my own poem when I was in college. And the 92-year-old professor liked the poem so much that she had me come up and read it to the rest of the class. And so I read that whole part, and by the end of it, the whole audience, Letterman's audience, were all singing, lie, la, lie, lie, la, lie, lie, lie. So it was really fun. I did the show a number of times, and the fact that it reminded me of when I was a little boy, when Jack Parr would have certain authors on, like Oscar Levant. He would have Jack Douglas, you know, humorists who came on. Not big names, you know, they weren't headliners, but that's what I enjoyed about the Letterman show. Writing for it, I never, you know, it was interesting. Not unlike Curb Your Enthusiasm, I never went to the office there. What had happened was Bill Sheft, who had been writing for Letterman since the beginning, called me up, and it was, an election was coming up. Maybe it was 2004, but I want to say 2008, okay? I think it was 2008. And they wanted some input. They wanted another voice this election season. And so here was the gig that I had. I'd wake up in the morning, I'd write 8 to 12 topical jokes, email them in, then start my own work. And then at night to see if they used any or how many of mine that they used. And I only did it for half a season. I originally was supposed to be for 13 weeks, and we did it for another 13, and then I didn't do it anymore. And it was funny because at that point, I hadn't written jokes in such a long time. I had to reteach myself, you know, how to say something. It was so many years since Weekend Update. It was so many years since the comics that I was writing for. Even the jokes that I had written for Billy for 700 Sundays, they were different because they were contextual. These were just beginning, middle, and end one-line jokes, monologue jokes. And it was, boy, it was great fun because I could do it in my pajamas if I had pajamas. Am I allowed to say underwear? Today. So that was the experience I had with that.
Do we have time for one more? Yeah, writing question. Yeah. So, look, because this is not only for the Television Academy, but also for the Writers Guild. I know this is going to be a very broad question, but just talk about what it is that you like about writing and being a writer.
It is a broad question, but what I like is that, what I like about writing is that I love words. I love word origins. I love, one of the things that Herb Sargent and I bonded with were words. How did certain expressions come about, and the order that you can put words in to convey a humor, or sadness, or whatever mood that you want. One of my heroes, who I ultimately spent time with, was Larry Gelbart. I had written a book called Clothing Optional, which was a collection of my published short stories and essays. And I asked him for a blurb, and I only had met him once or twice. And so I excused myself, my my audacity, you know. And he asked for 6 or 8 of the essays, and I sent him, and he wrote me this wonderful blurb. And then I took him to lunch as a repayment the next time I was out in LA. And I spent 3 hours with him, and I was like a a young kid with Mickey Mantle. You know, I felt exact. And what Larry Gelbart had was something I think every writer should aspire to have. Is you know, when Adolph Green, the great composer with Betty Comden, they wrote all those shows, right? When he died, Larry Gelbart sent a note to Adolph's now widow, Phyllis Newman. And the note was, that noise you hear is God breaking the mold. You know, which to me was poetry. You know, this is the way the man spoke. This is the way he wrote. And my friend Buck Henry is that way too, where there's an inherent wit in it. I don't claim to have their level of wit, but what I do like to do is I love the process of taking words and trying to put them in an order where you make a person laugh or whatever you want to. It's also, there's an omnipotence that a writer has, because you create characters, you create a world, and you populate them with these characters, and they behave and say what you want them to. And there's a feeling, the greatest part is that when you're successful, if on page, whether it's 4 or 20, where those characters tell you what they want to do, what they want to say. Even if you had preconceived he would do this, by that page you go, no, no, he wouldn't do that. He's telling me he wants to do that. And so I find it a fascinating thing, because I find it surprising, you know. It's tedious, especially when you do it alone. And that's why some of the books that I've written lately, I've collaborated with Dave Barry, because there are certain things you must write by yourself. But if you get the opportunity to collaborate, that's why I wrote a novel with Dave Barry. I just wrote a parody of the Passover Haggadah with Dave Barry and another guy named Adam Mansbach, who a few years ago had written a children's book that sold a gazillion copies. Children's book, the title was Go to Fuck to Sleep, okay? And, you know, once again, the process in television is collaborative, and it's a group. I miss that, so whenever I get the opportunity to do it, I do it. But when I'm doing stuff by myself, it becomes, okay, what are we trying to say today? How can we say it? And it's grueling. I wake up 5:30 every morning. If I have a great day, by noon, oh my God, 6.5 hours, you kidding? I'm spent, okay? But now it's noon and I'm in New Jersey. What am I gonna do with myself? But there are some days by 8 o'clock, you go, I don't have it today, you know? So I find myself intrigued by it, and also try to keep myself, I may have said it last time, forgive me if I did. There was, years ago, before I got married to Robin, did I tell you about the Neil Simon piece that was in the Arts and Leisure section of the Sunday Times?
No, no.
This is late 70s, right before I got married to Robin, right before we got engaged. We got married in 1979, so it was around then. Neil Simon had written a piece for the Arts and Leisure section of the Sunday Times, and this piece later became a preface for one of his anthologies, where he describes the comedy writer as a two-headed monster. One head is here talking to you, and then this head will get his car and drive, and maybe go to an ATM and have Thanksgiving, and you know, go to a dentist and stuff. But there's another head that all of a sudden, without provocation or announcement, will emerge and be up here, hover, and make fun of the life that this head is living. And that's where the comedy comes from, is the editorializing, however it's done, of this guy's life by this guy. And I remember before we got married, I had Robin read that, because I said, this is what you're going to be living with. You know, so it's not unusual where she'll come home and I'm on a couch like this in the living room, and she's coming in with God knows what from Costco. And she sees me there. She goes, "Can you help me?" I'm going, "Can't you see I'm working?" It looks like I'm asleep, you know, I'm working. Don't bother me with that big toilet paper thing. Oh, yeah. Okay. So, but I like it.
I think that's great. I have not read that Simon piece, but
Yeah, look it up. It
kind of nails it.
Yeah.
All right, Jenny, are we good?
We're good. Let's get this boy to lunch.
Oh, what time is